Meeting's being recorded. I will, Whitney. I'm going to do my best. I don't want you to have to retake this. All right. So tonight I want to focus on, let's see, he was telling me they saw hormones. Jane, as Jane mentioned, a large part of this week's material is all on control of blood flow and of essentially, in a sense, water volume, because water volume is stored in blood, and blood volume can change your pressure, and that can cause other problems. So we're going to talk about local control, which is this figure right here, with baroreceptors. So those are stretch receptors, if you recall, and what happens. And then we'll go into the hormones. There are a lot of questions about the hormones. You thought you were done, but no, indeed, we just keep going. In digestive system, we'll see quite a few. Urinary, we're going to visit many of these again. And then in reproductive has a whole new set. So, all right, so let me grab the book. This is one of those days where your best laid plans get delayed or put aside. It's PAC meeting, which is some ways easier. So the scouts aren't upstairs and trying to get them out the door before I come down here. I'm not a scout leader, but my husband is. But then it had to be too fun of a PAC meeting, so nobody wanted to leave. So I had to drag my family home early. And then the AC guy was here when we got here. So we were supposed to text him, and instead he decided, I guess, to show up because I told him it would be really close at 8 because I needed to be done by 8:30. So he was trying to do me a favor. Anyway, all right. And, you know, the really ironic thing is our AC's working now because they fixed it. But the fix was a temporary fix. Otherwise, it's going to be so expensive, they're going to just have to replace it. So we decided we could wait till it breaks and then replace it and be in the queue, because right now they're booking out several weeks already because so many people apparently need ones. Or we can just book it out now and hope the temporary fix stays until then. I know too much information. All you want to do is know about hormones and control. So I'm getting there. Let me grab it. I'm just trying to get to chapter 21. Anyway. All right, so this is figure 2140 on page 755. And if you have questions along the way, especially with those about hormones, please feel free to interject. I will be watching the chat to see if you have anything. These figures, I really actually like these homeostasis figures because it gives you both what happens if blood pressure increases or decreases. And even though often it is just the opposite, it doesn't always happen that way, and we'll see that a little more often as we get into here. That different things will stimulate, especially in the hormones, different reactions. It's not necessarily the opposite. But if for some reason blood pressure increases, which is going to happen one of two ways, we have an increase in blood volume, or we have a constriction of the vessel, increased resistance, I should say, which can come from a restriction of the vessel, a constriction, or it can come from buildup of fats, for example, that would cause essentially a smaller diameter. And so you're going to see blood pressure increase in those areas. This is one of those moment-to-moment type of regulations too. So this happens constantly. So let's just say you have a little bit more water, so a little bit more blood, your blood pressure increases. You're going to see that these baroreceptors are, because the vessel is being stretched more often than not, you're going to see that then signals to decrease sympathetic stimulation and increase essentially parasympathetic stimulation. Now what that does, if you recall, is when we increase parasympathetic stimulation, we are going to decrease the heart rate. And one of the reasons we decrease the heart rate is so that you have more time at rest. Hopefully that means that pressure, which if you recall, the pressure at rest is the diastolic pressure. The pressure at rest will start to diminish if there's more time. Now, the more time we have, the more blood we're going to really fill the ventricles, and so you are going to see an increase in ventricular volume or in stroke volume, which does increase overall cardiac output, but it doesn't put as much work on the heart muscle themselves. In fact, because the sympathetic nervous system not only increases our heart rate, it also increases the force of contraction. So the lack of that would mean that you probably are having a smaller injection fraction, so less blood is coming out at a time per stroke. And so in that sense, you're also hopefully decreasing that pressure right there at the aorta as the blood goes through. In addition, you're going to see, because of the lack of stimulation, you're going to see the blood vessels dilate, and that will also decrease resistance. If there's dilation, remember, that means the diameter increases and resistance goes down, which is the opposition to flow, so it should be able to flow, and you get this homeostasis restored. And once again, this is just one of those moment-to-moment type of things. So in this case, what happens is if the volume decreases a little bit, your blood pressure is decreasing just a little bit, then you're actually going to see that the baroreceptors aren't stressed, so they're not firing as much to the cardiovascular center. Actually, it's like a lack of stimulation, where here, as they stretch, they're going to fire and send impulses to the regulatory center that says, oh, we're stretched, we need, it's an indication of increased blood pressure. So this is really a lack of that stimulation, a lack of those signals. And because of that, we'll increase sympathetic stimulation, which, if you recall from the ANS chapter, that will increase the strength of contraction as well as the heart rate, as well as, depending on the receptors, type of receptors, will constrict vessels as well. So you're getting a large increase in pressure. Oh, I'm sorry, can you not hear me? Okay, Jane, thank you. Is this better? Are we having problems with volume again? Tell me if you can hear me okay, or if it's getting low again. I will check my microphone volume. It's getting low again? Okay, let's look at microphone. Okay, I get an echo when I do that, and I can hear it myself back fairly clearly. Whitney, you can hear. Okay, what about you, Melissa? Are you okay? Okay, so Jane, is this better if I talk closer to the mic? Okay. All right, so as I said, the lack of those firing signals from the baroreceptors then stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, and you should remember what happens there as far as increased heart rate, increased stroke volume, which is the increased force of contraction causes an increased force volume. Okay, so that happens. We also have, in order to help regulate regulate the cardiovascular system before we go on to hormones, we also have chemoreceptors. Now, chemoreceptors measure blood CO2 and blood O2. We'll learn more about this next week when we talk about the respiration system, but your brain is more sensitive to increased CO2 than it is to decreased oxygen. I'm just looking for the picture right now. Let's see, that's not it. Hang on. Ooh, it's weird. 142 is not in here. Let me see if it's in the old edition. I can pull it from there. Oh, here it is. So this is figure 2142. It looks pretty much the same, almost the same as this is the 9th edition one. The 10th edition one is on page 757. The concept's the same. They try to make it a little clearer, I think, as far as where those lines are going. So you'll see them a little differently in the 10th edition, but it kind of looks like this. So oh, those baroreceptors, I'm sorry. That's why it doesn't look the same, right? Okay. Let me try again. As you can see, the 9th edition's always catch. Nope, I don't have it. Okay. So we're going to look at this one anyway, because the picture is about the same. Just don't look at over here what it says. Let's just do this. I'm going to take a marker and just go, whoa, don't look at that. Because we're going to talk about chemoreceptors. But this is the picture in your book on the 10th edition of the chemoreceptor reflex. Hang on just for a second, okay? Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so for those of you that have the 10th edition, this is on page 757. And as I mentioned, blood CO2, partial pressure of CO2 anyway, the blood carbon dioxide level is, your brain is very sensitive to that. And that's because of this wonderful equation, which I'm going to write once again down here. maybe. Oh, see how fast I can do this? Plus. It is a bicarbonate buffer equation, and I've mentioned this before, but you really have to know this well. And that's because it dissociates to free hydrogen ions, and when it does that, free hydrogen ions are an indicator of pH. And so what happens if you have high CO2, you can see in the equation I just wrote down, the CO2 will combine with water, which we have plenty of in our body, and form carbonic acid, which then dissociates into free hydrogen ions, which contribute to pH, and bicarbonate. And so what happens is if you have high levels of CO2 in your blood, you're going to get a low pH. So your body's going to become more acidic, and your brain's really super sensitive to that. So when that happens, as it monitors that, it will cause either sympathetic or parasympathetic stimulation, depending on what we're seeing. So we're seeing an increase in CO2, which is a subsequent decrease in pH. You're going to decrease parasympathetic stimulation, which then causes a heart rate to increase. When you have the opposite, then you're going to see an increase in parasympathetic stimulation. So when we increase CO2 and we have a low pH, sympathetic stimulation increases heart rate and stroke volume. And part of that is you can get it into the lungs and then it breathe out the CO2. Then we can move that equation back to tie up the free hydrogen ions with the bicarbonate, and it moves back to carbon dioxide and water. So if we get rid of the CO2, the equation, in order to stay in equilibrium, has to shift to the left. And that's how we actually maintain, once again, blood volume with chemoreceptor reflex. And I shouldn't say blood volume, but cardiovascular system control, rather. Now, low oxygen levels will also, if they're really low, will also trigger a sympathetic response. You want to increase blood heart rate, or the movement of blood, I should say, through to the lungs so you can get more oxygen in them. You'll also see an increase in respiration rate, if you recall from that table, that huge table that you had to learn about. And so a decrease in oxygen will also help. But once again, CO2 is much more sensitive as far as your system and chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors measure those different electrolytes in our blood. So those are some of our moment-to-moment type of immediate actions type of thing. We call that short-term regulation, and that regulation will affect blood pressure, heart rate, which affects our cardiac output. There is, see if I have this one of those other summaries that we can go to. Right here. And this is on page 758. And this is just kind of a summary of what happens here with, oh, come on. There we go. With chemoreceptors detecting and what the response is, and then it decreased pH. And so this is pH, which is related to CO2 sensors. And the same here, if the blood pH is decreased, you have a more basic pH in your body. That also can cause real problems, as we're going to see next week in respiration. We'll talk about acid-base balance and high altitude sickness and a couple other things, but we'll find that any blood pH range between, anything after above 7.5 or 6 and anything really below 7.2 can cause major problems and death very quickly. 7.8 can cause death, and 7.0 can cause death. 7.2 you're pretty close, but 7.0 can also cause it. So the range is not very large if your system goes into a acid-base imbalance. And like I said, we'll talk more about that next week. But this is short-term regulation. Now, long-term regulation is where these hormones come in. And as Jane's already experienced, there's a lot of questions about that maybe are a little bit harder to figure out what you're supposed to be doing. So let's look at that. What I do like about the hormones that help regulate water, which help regulate pressure, they're all A hormones. So we're going to talk about, eventually we'll talk about ADH. The thing that's coming up right now, I believe, is renin-angiotensin. So angiotensin 2, actually, angiotensin 2, I should have written down. ADH, aldosterone, A and P. Okay, so we're going to see lots of A's. So in some ways that's easy, and in other ways it makes it a little bit more difficult. This is the renin-angiotensin system. Now this is process figure 2144 on page 760. And what most students have a tendency to miss on the exam is that they think that renin, let me get my, oops, that's not what I wanted. That's what I wanted. Get my, they think renin is a hormone, but it's not. It's just an enzyme. An enzyme is something that helps catalyze a reaction, helps a reaction go, but doesn't change the reaction in that sense at all. And so renin acts as an enzyme, and it helps convert an inactive hormone to an active hormone. And that's the process of renin. And we focus so much on renin because that's the first substance released that students really get that mixed up. And there are several tricksy questions about that. So let's look first to see what's happening here. Oh, okay. So if you have decreased blood pressure, I'll have to just remove that. Your kidney actually senses that. It senses that there's not the same amount of pressure, and so that kidney releases renin, which once again is an enzyme. Now renin in the blood, once it's released, will convert angiotensinogen, which is an inactive, or sometimes we call them prohormones because they're not quite hormones. It will cleave a couple of enzymes or a couple of amino acids off and convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Now angiotensin 1 is hormone-like in the sense it does have some minor constriction effects. It's not as strong as angiotensin 2, which is the hormone that we'll talk about. But angiotensin 1 is now traveling in the blood, and like I said, it does have some minor effects, but as it goes through the lungs, takes its trip through the lungs to get oxygenated, there is an enzyme here, angiotensin converting enzyme, that then shaves off a couple more amino acids and converts to angiotensin 2. Now, angiotensin 2 is a very strong vasoconstrictor. It is the hormone, the first hormone that we're talking about is angiotensin 2. And it does two things. Like I said, it's a very strong vasoconstrictor, but it also stimulates the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. So it is a positive feedback or positive stimulation for aldosterone. And when aldosterone is released, aldosterone works at the site of the kidney to increase water absorption by increasing sodium absorption. Where in the kidney we'll get to in a couple of weeks when we talk about urinary system. But for this exam, because you will have this in the next exam as well as in exam 4 as well. But in exam 3, you just need to know that aldosterone stimulates water retention by stimulating sodium retention. And as such, when you keep salt, you keep water, you're going to have less urine, you're going to have more water in your blood, you'll increase blood pressure. In addition to vasoconstriction, which we know as we decrease the diameter, we increase the resistance and increase the pressure within that vessel fairly dramatically. So you can also see that as you increase water absorption and have lower urine volume, you're going to see more water. So it's a very powerful mechanism, and it has two different ways of going about getting increased water into your blood to increase your pressure. So that's the renin-angiotensin system. Renin, once again, is the enzyme that kind of starts it all, but angiotensin 2 is the, let me just do this. Oh, I keep doing it wrong. Sorry. Maybe if I, there we go. Okay, so angiotensin 2 is the hormone, and aldosterone is a hormone. You have two hormones working in conjunction with each other in order to build up the pressure, even though it's a longer term regulation, it's something that can happen within hours, and so it's not immediate, but it's fairly quick, and it will last longer too, so that's pretty awesome. So those are two hormones, angiotensin 2 and aldosterone. Once again, angiotensin 1 has some weak, but still can have some vasoconstriction, but not nearly the strength that you see in angiotensin 2. Okay? And these enzymes, the converting enzyme, is just something that exists in the lungs. So that just happens to be where it is, and where it's created, and so as that blood goes through, which it does fairly frequently, as you know, goes through the pulmonary circulation before the systemic circulation, that can happen fairly quickly. Okay, so those are those two. ADH, if you recall, is the posterior pituitary hormone, and it is made in the hypothalamus and stored in the pituitary. And it actually is released in response to change in osmolarity. So it's very sensitive. So here are osmoreceptors. So these measure osmolarity. And just as a brief reminder, osmolarity is essentially the solute concentration in water. So if, for instance, sodium chloride breaks into 2 particles, the osmolarity reflects that, rather than just the molarity, which would be of the solution in general. So the osmolarity actually reflects how many particles the substance that's dissolved breaks into. Our normal body osmolarity is about 300 milliosmoles, but if that decreases, normally that pressure will decrease. If you're losing a lot of fluid, this is decreasing blood pressure. So let's go that route. So if you decrease blood pressure, you're decreasing water, you're going to see an increase in osmotic pressure. If you have less water in your blood, then the osmolarity is going to increase. So it's just like taking water off a salt solution. If you boil some off, what's remaining is going to be higher in a salt solution. Same thing with osmolarity. You have more particles and less water. So that increase in pressure is an indication that you have decreased blood pressure. There's not as much water, and that will cause the posterior pituitary to release ADH. Now, ADH has effects on 2 different places. It has an effect on the blood vessel, and it has its effect on the kidney. Now, in the kidney, it is a direct reabsorption of water. So you don't need any other electrolyte, like aldosterone increases sodium, which then increases water. But ADH will directly increase absorption of water where it normally doesn't happen. Once again, we don't have to worry about that specifics until the urinary system, which then we're going to revisit this whole thing. But it will directly increase water reabsorption. It will also cause vasoconstriction over here in the blood vessels. And so you're decreasing the diameter to increase pressure, you're increasing water to increase the volume, and ultimately getting this detection of blood pressure essentially back up. Okay. Now, if you have more water, then your osmotic pressure actually decreases. So that is ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and that's how it's stimulated, is by the change in osmolarity. And in fact, I don't know if your book says this, but there is a source that we used to use that indicates that it can be even a change of 2 or 3 milliosmoles. So ADH is a fairly important hormone. If you recall, when ADH is lacking, that's what we call diabetes insipidus, where a person just is always thirsty, constantly drinking, but also constantly urinating because we don't save any of that water they're intaking. And so, once again, it's diabetes insipidus, and you're probably going to see it, if not in this exam, certainly in the 4th exam, because we kind of mix that up with diabetes mellitus, kind of make sure that you understand the difference between the two. But this is a very large water loss because you don't have ADH in order to help reabsorb the water. So it actually is probably constantly, in some effect, being stimulated as your osmolarity just changes slightly. I once had an instructor tell me that if you're thirsty, it's already too late. You've already put yourself out of homeostasis, and so we should be drinking enough water that we never are really thirsty. I always thought that was an interesting philosophy. I don't do that as well as I should, but the idea is that if you can actually sense thirst, then your osmolarity's changed enough that this system's already in effect. All right, there's one other hormone I want to talk about, and we don't have a diagram for it, but it's ANP or ANH. It's known by both. Let me write ANH here, because your book actually calls it, your edition now actually calls it ANH. I don't remember what the 9th did, but the 8th certainly called it ANP. So ANH is atrial natriuretic hormone. It's a polypeptide, that's why it's sometimes known as ANP for peptide. And it is released from the atria, hence the first part atrial. And what happens is if the atria are really stretched, because the atria holds just a little bit of blood, and most of the time those AV valves are open, and so the blood just goes into the ventricles. You just were tested on that. But if the atria happen to stretch, then you have a lot of blood volume. And so ANH is specifically released when you have too much blood volume, or perhaps a pressure in the atria is a little high. And when that happens, it actually goes to the kidneys, ANH, and says, okay, let's lose more sodium. And if you lose more sodium, you'll lose water. That's something we'll really talk about in the urinary system. But wherever sodium goes, water will follow. A lot of people really subscribe to the whole salt in your diet thing causes your blood pressure. Now, the amount of salt you'd have to intake would be fairly high to really affect your blood pressure chronically. But there is some truth to the idea that if you intake a lot of sodium, water is going to follow. And so if you, in the manner of ANH, it causes the release of sodium in the urine, you're also going to release water into the urine, because water will follow the sodium, just in a natural movement, osmotic movement. And then once again, there's permeability issues in certain membranes that allow that to affect. But when that happens, then you'll decrease blood volume, which will then decrease the stretching of the atria, which will decrease your blood pressure overall. So all of them but ANH, so ADH, angiotensin II, and aldosterone, those all help us save water. ANH helps us lose water. And that's really the kind of the trick for understanding the hormones here in the circulation, in the cardiovascular system and circulation. So I'm going to show one more little diagram here. And I think this is, let's see if I can find it, 46. Okay, this is on page 762, and this is a summary of hormones. And I think if you focus on this will really help, because it has the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone mechanism, and it has the atrial natriuretic mechanism. What happens if blood pressure increases? What happens if it's decreased? And obviously, if it's decreased, this goes into effect. If it's increased, this goes into effect. And it, it's just essentially saying if it's increased, then we're not going to see renin produced, and we're not going to see angiotensin II be activated, that type of thing. And so, and the reactions that occur here. So this is a good summary for these hormones, since you don't have a really great hormone table like we did in the endocrine chapters. This is probably your best bet for that. And then I just want to finally tell you that there are a couple of questions about the clinical impact on page 763. There is, I know for sure, a final question about shock and septic shock, actually. And that's close to my heart, as I mentioned to you in the announcement, I think last week, that I was your predict question. So if you've gone through the predict question, I will actually be posting that in Notes from Instructor, a little bit what happened to me. We still don't really know why that happened, but do read through what shock happens and what happens in shock and why certain different types of shock that there are, because like I said, there will be questions on the quizzes, and you may get some on the exam. Now, while Jane is typing, I will tell you that chapter 22 is just really basically, we don't spend a lot of time with it. There's only, I think, 2 questions on your exam that are even pulling from the lymphatic system, but it's a good read through. Just those first couple pages, just to the thymus section, so just at the top of 778. So you're looking at, 8 pages, I think, of just what is the lymphatic system, how does it function, and I think it's good information just to kind of get an idea, even though we don't spend a lot of time with it. You'll spend more time with it in your subsequent physiology courses, I'm sure. But they've just chosen not to do too much of it. A lot of it is delving more into the protection mechanism, white cells and cytokines and things like that. And so we've opted just to have you stop to know essentially what a lymph node is, what a lymphocyte is, what the thymus and the spleen do, just so you can kind of get an idea. So just kind of read through that. Like I said, there are only 2 questions are pulled from the exam, so don't spend a lot of time with it. Just kind of read through it. You may see more quiz questions that you do on the exam, but the exam specifically only pulls 2. So, and they may be related enough to circulation and white cells and defense that you may not even realize that they came from the lymphatic system. So I'm not going to really spend much time with that. I do want to tell you that so we have circulation 1 and 2. We've been dealing with that in chapter 21, spending 2 weeks in chapter 21, and then the little 8 pages of 22. And then next week we'll talk about the respiratory system, and you'll have a lab regarding respiratory system. And I'll encourage you now to please do your lab first if you have both before you consider taking the exam. The lab will help you in learning the respiratory system and the volumes in the lung that you'll need to have for your next exam. So, kind of keep that in mind. If you have both, try to do the lab early and then focus on the respiratory system. Next week, we'll be talking all about respiration and the lung volumes and acid-base balance. So there's actually a little bit about acid-base balance anyway, because we do talk more about it with the urinary system as well. So respiratory system, urinary system, circulation, a lot of those go hand in hand with each other, and so we'll address some of it now and some of it in the next exam. Okay, do you have any questions at this point? Yes, Whitney, it is. It is the same ADH that we talked about that's created in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary. Perfect. I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, Melissa. And then Jane. We'll just see if anybody else has any other questions. Okay, great. We'll just wait for Jane, and then if no one else has any other questions after Jane, then have a great night, and thank you for coming, and thank you for being patient. I did not expect this to happen. In fact, I think even when talking with Whitney, told her that he may call, ended up calling after you and I talked, and then, like I said, ended up showing up a little earlier. Well, a little earlier than I anticipated, but it's been taking a little bit longer than I thought. So. Okay, thank you. All right, then. Have a great night. Thank you, ladies, for coming. It is, especially when we're going to have a really bad summer, Whitney. I just know it, just by virtue of this mild winter we had. Anyway.